Thank you for listening to Mormon Sex Info. This episode is an archived episode and is only now becoming publicly available. Mormon Sex Info relies on contributions. To contribute, please visit mormonsex.info. And now, please enjoy this episode.
Hello and welcome to Mormon Sex Info. This is Natasha Helfer Parker, and I am thrilled to have Ricky and Larry Siegel with me today on the show. They are about to come out to Utah for a great training that we're going to be hosting actually as part of the Mormon Mental Health Association called Challenging the Sex Addiction Model. Meant for clinicians, but we're opening it up to the public as well. So I'm very excited to have them coming out, and also very excited to have them here with me today. And
thanks so much, Natasha. We're really happy to be here.
Yeah, no, I'm so happy to have you. I would really love to invite each of you to just give us a little bit of your background and tell us a little bit about who you are.
My brother Larry, please.
Sure. I'm Larry Siegel, and a clinical sexologist for almost 30 years now. Had been in private practice for many years. Spend most of my time now doing professional training and education.
And I'm Ricky Siegel, and I started in this field really in a series of happy accidents, and started by inheriting my brother's jobs for a period of time. I followed him at Planned Parenthood as a sexuality educator, which was 15 years and afforded me the opportunity to go back to school. My original undergraduate degree was kind of a graduate degree in pharmacology and research, and that led me to working in the addiction field when Larry was working as the first male sexuality educator for Planned Parenthood in Florida, and started us on this kind of sexuality and addiction work that I suppose started with the mandates for HIV education for addiction treatment staff, and led us to realize that there was this huge unaddressed area. There's a lot of sexuality issues that were obvious to everybody in the addiction field that related to addiction, both how substance abuse and other, we'll say, addictions impact on sexual development, and how sexuality plays a role in addiction. And we started there about 25 years of working with treatment centers, and really encouraging, as you know from our meetings at sex therapy conferences, encouraging what we refer to as a sexological and certainly sex therapy approach to problematic sexual behaviors, rather than this kind of, we have a cultural fascination right now in this country with sex addiction, and of course it's a very popular media thing, but unfortunately too much of our mental health and medical professions have gone along with this cultural trend and are too quick to knee-jerk go to a sex addiction conclusion, and then a whole dynamic begins that I hope we can talk about this evening.
Wonderful, thank you so much. And yeah, you're both very much part of the ASECT community, which I've talked about often on this podcast before, and it's actually where I met you both and watched you just really give a fabulous presentation.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, so let's start off by, just to give a preface, the main topic tonight will be around some of the neuroscience claims that we hear a lot in the media and just general public about how pornography affects the brain, or even sex addiction, or these kinds of, and we'll talk about the different terms. But before we even get into that, I'd like to just spend a little bit of time about what this interview is not about, because there's quite a bit of hoopla right now in our community as far as using the terms of sex addiction, and some of us within the Mormon community are challenging, we're challenging, I guess, those who are working with Mormons not to be coming from that particular framework and things of that nature. And then there's a lot of assumptions that are made, like, well, then we must feel that any type of behavior goes and that there should be no limits. And what about spouses who feel betrayed, and are we minimizing their experience or pain? And so I just would like to talk a little bit about what this interview is not about. Can you help me out with that?
Sure.
Sure.
Terrific.
And I think that's a really good starting point for it, because people do, I think, often jump to that binary perspective. It's kind of like you're with us or you're against us. So if we don't come out and agree with the sex addiction model, then we are opposed to it, and everything that goes along with that. And I think it's really important to stress that that is not the case. The label, the concept of sex addiction, is definitely what we take issue with. The fact that people are engaging in behaviors, sexual behaviors that are problematic, that is not a matter of debate. That people are in relationships where partners feel betrayed and feel hurt, we don't take issue with that. We do not in any way take issue with the fact that sexual behavior for a lot of people can at least feel like it gets out of hand, and in many cases, through the result of whatever is driving their series of choices, end up doing a lot of damage to themselves and others. But the mistake is in calling that an addiction. The mistake is in saying that that is something beyond the individual's control, and in a sense, trying to convince everybody to live with this specter of, like I said a few minutes ago, this boogeyman that is going to jump out at any time. So
right, like once an addict, always an addict type of.
Right, and it's a lifelong struggle. It's a lifelong vigilance. We tend to call that obsessive compulsive behavior, but that's on the other side of it.
And I just, in the vast majority of cases, from my vantage point as a sex therapist, I just really believe that it's seldom about the porn. And it's become, part of this obsession I alluded to, is that it's still, like a lot of media, it's lascivious and salacious and tantalizing and scandalous, but it's really, it's again symptomatic of intimacy dysfunction, and very often sexual dysfunction. So it's a couple's issue. So I know, you mentioned a lot of the bristling reaction to this kind of language is that, we're blaming the partner. Well, how do I say this diplomatically? It is a couple's issue in the vast majority of cases. So while it's perfectly understandable that a partner who discovers an aspect of their partner's sexuality that they didn't know before and is maybe disturbing or shocking, is not symptomatic of a disease that they need to drag them in sometimes by the ear, like an angry parent. And here, I mentioned needing to talk about the changing dynamic in a relationship when these kinds of crises occur. And, dragging them in by the ear, or her, whoever the, quote, sex addict is, and say, fix this person and maybe I won't take the kids and leave. And there now the betrayed is now in control, justifiably angry, and has absolutely no reflection necessary, no thinking, wow, do I have a role in this? What has happened to our relationship? I often ask this rhetorical question, how many porn addicts are thinking about porn on the honeymoon? And isn't that symptomatic of the very usually very natural changes in relationships? But if not, addressed and talked about and honest, things become secretive, and that's where the feelings of betrayal happen.
Yeah, so if I hear you correctly, it's this idea that when we adopt an addiction model perspective, it becomes one person's problem and needs to be fixed versus really opening up a conversation about the sexual parameters of an entire relationship and which is not something most people are good at. It's not like we're taught how to do that very well. But I think especially from a Mormon perspective, a lot of this is set up by our culture. I mean, our leaders flat out will basically tell you how to respond. If you catch somebody doing this is how you should feel. This is going to ruin your marriage. This is going to be, the worst betrayal that you can ever imagine. And they, use horrific words like, perverse and evil. And, so the shame is just, pretty profound. And so, yeah, that it's problematic on a lot of different fronts, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And I think, part of what Ricky was also alluding to in all of that was this idea that if it's something that occurs within the context of a relationship, then even though one person may be the one engaging in the behavior, the fact that it's in a relationship means that there is a responsibility to be shared. It doesn't mean the partner who's feeling all hurt and betrayed, it's their fault. That's not what we're saying either. But the fact that they are a component of the relationship, so where is their responsibility in this whole thing? Particularly in terms of dealing with it. Whose story is the one being told?
As sex therapists, a very typical diagnostic question, often in the first session, might be, when was your most recent shared sexual intimacy? And if someone, maybe they might look at each other and look at their watch and say, oh, I think it's been about 7-8 years, wouldn't you say? Then, there's a pile of information that gives us a glimpse into the dynamic of the relationship. And of course, if we follow that up with what was it like at the beginning of the relationship, we know that it doesn't matter liberal or conservative or religious or not. Most people say, oh, at the beginning it was hot, it was passionate, it was the honeymoon phase. And very often it's as simple as tracing that back. How's the relationship changed from then to now, and what do we have to do to put this crisis in the rearview mirror and use it as a kind of a wake-up call to be intentional and bring the relationship back to where it was.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's hopefully clear that there's a difference between saying, stereotypically, oh, wife, it's your fault, your husband's looking at porn. That's not what we're saying at all. Right, we're saying that this issue is pretty complex and that there's lots of things that go into these types of issues. And although one person might be more responsible for certain behaviors, obviously, that both are responsible for the quality and content and ability to talk about their relationship and what's happening within it, especially within a sexual realm.
Exactly.
Yeah. If I could make another point, since we're all so used to using this phrase without even considering it, I love pointing out that the expression "looking at porn" has become the new sleeping together. Right? This kind of innuendo that most sexual language is filled with because of our discomfort, that everybody knows that there's something other than sleeping going on when we're talking about sleeping together. And I think it's pretty clear that there's something else going on when we are, quote, looking at porn, like both hands on the keyboard. Well, the more uncomfortable issue that we're not talking about is that it's about self-pleasuring. Even masturbation is such a back-tightening, guilt and embarrassment-inducing term that we short-circuit any kind of loving sexual relationship with ourselves because of usually, messages we've grown up with about the inappropriateness. And so even that, inhibits people going into relationships when they can't be freely sexually open with one another. So our work, the silver lining is always that even in the most, even in crisis, we can help couples really connect in ways they might not have ever have.
And I just want to also say that we would all agree that sexual behavior can become quite problematic for a certain amount of the population.
Absolutely, mm-hmm. Of course.
Yeah, and anything that gives pleasure, particularly profound pleasure, for some individuals can be taken to those extremes. But I think we always have to remain focused on what the issues really are.
Yeah, back to, I don't want to lose sight of the topic you want us to talk about, and again, this notion of looking for a neurological medical explanation. As we've discussed previously with some of the online objections to your position statement. We see a long history. First of all, one of the objections was incorrect, that this is some new disease that we just don't have enough research on because it's too new. It's been 20 years of trying to get hypersexuality, that's sort of the foot in the door to get sex addiction recognized clinically, which 20 years of attempting to find a research basis has not occurred. So in some ways, and I apologize up front if this is offensive to any of your podcast listeners, but this idea of neurotransmitter dysregulation, I see it as kind of like a new version of intelligent design, a way of taking something that may turn off some people because it's too spiritual or religious sounding, so we'll make it a little more scientific and medical sounding, but it still really fails to explain the complexity of a person's relationship with their own sexuality and people's relationships with each other. And, it can't explain something like an impulse control problem or a compulsivity, which is really about attempting to soothe anxiety in most cases, and say, oh, it's, your dopamine's a little low, or your serotonin's problematic. So, of course, the big pharma medical model fits that well. For years, Larry and I can't escape the biggest irony of all, is that the treatment industry, the chemical dependency and addiction treatment industry that is presumably for getting people off drugs, has now begun, now treatment for 100% of people who go to treatment begins usually with a medication evaluation and being put on drugs. So there's a little irony.
Yeah, you're talking about substance abuse treatment centers?
Well, across the board, because now if somebody, notice also there's been a transition in the sex addiction field to also change the language to much more of a focus on trauma. And again, I see it as an attempt to medicalize and get more of a kind of a psychiatric explanation. And, more often than not, unfortunately, that comes with diagnosing. I see very rampant in addiction treatment centers this kind of dual diagnosis that's dealt out like cards in a deck of bipolar disorder and borderline personality disorder, and people being put on meds. Now in sex addiction, there's compulsivity and trauma, and again, diagnosing. See, this is what, as I mentioned to you earlier, this is what I find frustrating. They can go down a path of trauma and look for explanations, but there's resistance to just recognizing that the problem behavior may be connected to garden variety depression or anxiety or sexual dysfunction. And it's that basic that we can enhance addiction treatment, but we resist and avoid because we're not comfortable talking about sex unless it's sex addiction or sexual trauma.
So meaning that if somebody deems that there's problematic sexual behavior, people are much more comfortable with the assumption that there's trauma that must have led to this.
Yeah.
I mean, it can be. I mean, trauma does lead to a lot of things, but it doesn't necessarily have to mean that.
Right.
All right. So I've noticed in some of your writings that you take issue sometimes with just even the definition. So, there's a lot of these words that are thrown out there: sex addiction, porn addiction, hypersexuality. Can you spend a little bit of time just parsing out these words?
Well, I guess part of the issue is often maybe just clunky language. And so if folks say, okay, well, if you don't like sex addiction, well, what do you call it then? And then, we want to avoid any impression that it's just a matter of semantics. So there's people that say, well, you call it addiction, we call it compulsivity, but meet you at the end of the day and we're all really doing the same thing. That's missing a very, very important point about that diagnostic curiosity that I said before, that it's not just what we call it, but unfortunately, we've all been struggling for a long time with a reasonable alternative that's as quick and easy and catchy as sex addiction. And Eli Coleman's model is impulsive/compulsive sexual behavior problems, which is really spot on, but not easy to say, and that might be. I don't know if that confounds things. So even as trying to identify it as sex addiction, if someone goes to like a 12-step model, like the addiction treatment model, so Alcoholics Anonymous, it becomes problematic now if the sex addict sees their drug of choice, sex, like a heroin addict or a crack addict, and so they look for a 12-step meeting and find that depending on where in the country they live, they might find 5 different 12-step fellowships, from Sex Addicts Anonymous to Sexaholics Anonymous, Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous, Sexual Compulsives Anonymous, and Sexual Recovery Anonymous, all of which use the same tools, the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, but define addiction differently, define sobriety differently, and define relapse differently. So even in the sex addiction recovery community, there's no consensus about what the disease is that they're suffering from and how to treat it.
Yeah, but I also want to say that there are some differences in how people often conceptualize them. When you listen to the way a lot of people describe sex addiction, you see it's very, very much in line with models of chemical dependencies and substance addictions. They just kind of change the word alcohol or drug to sex. So it's very much that same kind of model. But if you talk to people about, that sort of ascribe to the notion of hypersexuality, you're basically seeing people that will have more of a mental health I think approach or basis for them looking at it, but it kind of has the very same arbitrarily moralistic undertone to it, looking at behaviors specifically like self-pleasuring, infidelity, using of prostitutes, pornography, that, still all of those are characterized as negative, so anybody who's engaging in those behaviors with any kind of regularity, especially if they may feel guilty about it, that is a psychopathology. Compulsive sexual behavior, as Ricky mentioned, something that Eli Coleman has written quite a bit about, is for some people a little bit closer, for other people just another term to describe the same idea of, I don't want to engage in this behavior, but I can't stop. Now, I would like to say that before this all got very, very popular and trendy, and before all these industries sprang up around the treatment of sex addiction and any other excuse to pathologize sexual behavior, particularly things that have to do with the more uncomfortable aspects of it, like porn and multiple partners and infidelity and things like that.
It's just that there's kind of a cultural sex negativity in much of it makes sense if your culture of recovery is based on the fact that your sexuality is somehow broken or diseased, right? The parallel to chemical dependency is really problematic because we don't have to have liquor or cocaine or heroin, but we have to be sexual beings. Now we can choose not to engage in sexual behaviors that make us not feel good. I mean, if we're honest and recognize our true sexual selves, that's a pretty good perk of being a human being, that we can enjoy inhabiting our own bodies and experience pleasure in our bodies with ourselves, with our partners. So if we make that broken, and with, of course, the addict, once an addict, always an addict model, which is not the same as a medical or pharmacological model, that once you go through detox, you're no longer addicted. But of course, in recovery communities, once an addict, always an addict. So for the rest of your life, you'll have to recognize that you can't trust your sexuality. You can't trust your desires for pleasure, and have to have some kind of a leash or a community control bracelet on your ankle.
What I also had meant to say was that terms, particularly like sexual compulsivity and hypersexuality, used to be terms that were reserved for particular types of brain dysfunction, particularly lesions in different areas of the brain. In Alzheimer's treatment, for example, L-DOPA.
Parkinson's.
Parkinson's. Any of those sort of dopaminergic type of medications. These are the kinds of things that would lead into descriptions like hypersexuality or sexual compulsivity. Now it's pretty much all interchangeable. Sex addiction, sexual compulsivity, hypersexual, it's all the same. And people have this very cavalier way of just sort of using these terms interchangeably.
And again, it's really a long history, from the old-fashioned diagnoses of nymphomania or satyriasis, or all of the uncontrollable sexual appetites have long been threatening. Of course, a pretty obvious question to the idea of hypersexuality is how much is too much, and who gets to define, right? Even we can't forget that before we're even talking about sex addiction, the very concept of addiction is not a clinical one. People really don't understand that there is no such diagnosis as addiction. A psychotherapist or a psychiatrist cannot put on a form for insurance addiction. There's chemical dependency, there's withdrawal. These are medical conditions, substance abuse. But addiction is kind of user-defined and socially defined, and it doesn't help that chocolate advertises as addictively delicious, or we make light of our caffeine addictions, but it's not a helpful concept, because, as I said before, it cuts off that diagnostic process that especially we therapists are obliged to follow, to be curious and find out what is driving a behavior. If somebody says that they're engaging in a behavior that's causing that's destructive and unmanageable in the parlance of 12-step circles, then of course you don't have to be a therapist to ask, why are you doing that? Why are you doing something that you say you hate and don't want to do? So that, if it's, as I said before, typically it's an attempt at self-soothing or again, we'll use that term, medicating anxiety or, again, sexual dysfunction. I have a new client just started this week that told me he's seen 10 therapists, and for the first time has talked about his problem with using porn and masturbation to self treat his anxiety. It's a lot of time and money wasted for this really confused and now kind of self-loathing 27-year-old.
Yeah, and then added complexity too, which I've spoken a lot about in previous podcasts, but who gets to define, you've mentioned who gets to define these words. And so one of my main concerns in Mormon culture is not to minimize that sometimes, yes, there are problematic behaviors, but that any behavior that deviates from what's religiously acceptable now becomes pathologized. And that's a pretty wide spectrum, and the studies showing that, is it 80% of Christian men right now are considering themselves sex addicts?
Wow. Wow.
And it depends on where you read, because there are a number of some in that particular one, in that group, 80% in that group, 60% in another group, 92% in this group. I mean, these are all, again, we're looking at, in many ways, skewed populations.
Right, which is why this is of so much interest to me, because this is the population I work in, where already there's a lot of cultural expectation about how we conduct ourselves sexually, and there's no ability to kind of separate that. There's unwanted behavior because I have certain religious values, and that's different from having an out of control compulsive issue that would really fall into, I think, we've mentioned people who will masturbate 30 times a day and are, to the point that they're raw, or there's, prefrontal damage. And so there's no ability to even, I want to say,
there's no disinhibition. I mean, there's
right. So they'll just go up to anybody and kind of start humping, or, being completely inappropriate with public members, or, so I think that's kind of what you were talking about with some of these disease models.
When you have something like these bilateral temporal lobe damage, or some of these frontotemporal lesions, or even adhesions, you'll see some of that behavior. But even somebody with a high degree of anxiety, it's not out of control. But isn't that a nice way to mitigate one's shame? Instead of acknowledging the choice and the responsibility, basically give it that moniker of, it's out of control, it's not my fault, it's something else doing it to me.
Yeah, particularly when the label gets attached to behaviors like cheating and persistent long-term cheating. I can't help it, I have a disease, when it's just really a path, like Larry said, for bad behavior and poor decision making and poor impulse control.
Right. Now let me qualify this, because I know even some of the comments that people have written in, and some of that, I don't want anybody to think that we are trivializing or invalidating their experience and any suffering that they may have gone through. Not at all. But that doesn't change the fact that, as uncomfortable as it may make us feel to acknowledge that we are in control of this behavior that we are ashamed of, and therefore have to be in control in order to change that behavior so we can no longer have to feel ashamed of it or ourselves. But either way, we have to be able to not only take, but embrace the responsibility and ownership of that behavior.
Okay, so let's move along then to much of what I guess the research claims are out there. There's research articles that sound very medical and have all these fancy terms. I've written some of them down. I don't even know what they mean. We're talking about ventral striatum. I'm not even sure if I'm saying that right. There's hypofrontal syndromes. There's lots of claims about addiction and sex addiction having chemical changes in the brain or creating chemical changes in the brain. We do hear, the media doesn't necessarily use those terms, but we do hear, we see, news reports that are titled things like porn, the new drug, lights up your brain, changes your brain. So let's talk a little bit about what is some of the research out there that is problematic and why.
Okay. Well, let me start by saying that all of the research that you would be able to talk about, and there are a lot of these studies, all of them are problematic in this context, because none of them are, I think, being cited or interpreted correctly. And I know that's a big thing to say, but let me tell you why I say that. Very, very generally, if you look at all of the research that is designed to show an underlying mechanism to addiction, right? Now, that is a lot of their intent. So you've got to keep in mind that is their starting point. So what a lot of this research is showing through functional MRIs, through a number of different types of various of neurochemical assays, different types of EEGs. I mean, doing all kinds of high-tech scanning and assaying, but their basic premise is what they're trying to validate. If you look at it the other way around, in other words, if you're starting with the concept that this is addiction and we're looking for the underlying cause of addiction, this is where they're seeing a connection. But if you don't start there, if you start from, let's look at what some of these brain functions or brain activities are, and let's see if this can take us into addiction, it won't. Right? So the comparisons that people are making are kind of continual reiterations of the same false premise, that because you can see areas of the brain lighting up when people are doing drugs that make them feel good. Now, we have to qualify that, because if you just say, well, when people do drugs, you're not going to see those areas of the brain light up if somebody's taking penicillin. It's only drugs that produce euphoric effects. And that's an important qualifier, because if we then broaden out this view, we can see those areas of the brain that light up with drugs that produce euphoric effects are the same brain areas that light up when anybody is experiencing any other sense of euphoria.
Getting a massage, seeing their Facebook post liked on Facebook.
Absolutely. That's a big one, actually. There's a lot of research in England that shows how those same pathways, those circuitries for reward and reinforcement that people like to sort of define as cocaine pathways, are really lit up when people are on social media talking about themselves. So if we look at this same brain research and apply it in exactly the same way, then we would have to come to exactly the same conclusion and say that narcissism is an addiction. Narcissism and being egocentric is a brain disease, because when people talk about themselves on social media, those areas of the brain light up. But when they are listening to somebody else talk about themselves, they go dark. Now, we can make exactly the same inferences from that data that these people are making when it comes to sex and porn. That's what I'm saying. If we're not starting with the presumption that the addiction is real and that, see, this is justifying it, it doesn't work.
Yeah, I think this goes back to this whole new burgeoning field of neuroscience and addiction. Started with Patrick Carnes, and we attended a lecture of his, and I'm pretty sure it was 1990 or 92, where he was showing brain scans and a brain scan image. I suppose we were to take him at his word. That was a brain scan image of somebody smoking crack. And then in the next slide, he said it was a brain scan of somebody looking at porn, and made a great aha about the fact that these same parts of the brain were active. And this is from where we got this kind of cultural message that porn is the new crack, and that people, especially young people, can be instantly addicted from a single exposure and off to the races. And it's really kind of it's spurious as scientific research and conclusions go to make such a connection. As someone who's not a physician, not a neuroscientist, not a radiologist, just someone in addiction, I have to stick in an aside here. Another frustration is this notion that a sex addiction therapist is kind of an equivalent to a sex therapist, when the vast majority of sex addiction therapists have no training in sexuality, which is just so frustrating, and for so many obvious reasons. That, I would give shout outs to people I have a lot of respect for in the field. Like I know you had Joe Court as a guest on your podcast, and we had the good pleasure of having a meeting of the minds with a CSAT, a sex addiction therapist in Atlanta named Bill Herring. I have a tremendous amount of respect for, he's a trained sex therapist, and he can see these. We might not agree on the kind of etiology piece we're making, but we can approach this as a sexological problem, and often as a couples issue. And like I said before, an opportunity to reboot a relationship.
Yeah. And the cynical part of me also has to throw in that even as you were struggling and asking your question, Natasha, there are people that will have no trouble bringing up the ventral striatum or the ventral tegmental area or any of the nucleus accumbens or dorsal striatum, just as a way of trying to make themselves sound more intelligent than they really are about this stuff.
It's quite intimidating. It sounds very important.
As it's meant to be, because these same people will look at those same areas and pretty much say the same thing. Dopamine. It all means the same thing to them. It means it's dopamine. And it's all about these dopamine spikes, and it's dopamine and these reward systems and dopamine. And it really isn't. I mean, it's involved, certainly, but these people are obsessed with, first of all, they're obsessed with dopamine and misunderstand its role completely. Also, it's not just a bias in a lot of the science here. It's just not good science. The brain is an integrative organ. It doesn't work in isolation. So just because you can look in one window and see activity happening in one area, it does not give you any insight or any clue about what's happening in other areas of the brain or what the implications of that activity may be. You have people that will interpret these scans, and they'll say, look, this person has experience looking at porn or even with drugs. This came out not long ago with marijuana. People using marijuana, there's a part of their brain that is changed compared to people who don't use marijuana. Now, the scientific question that follows that should very simply be, so what? What does that mean? And that's a question nobody is answering. They're just looking at the fact that there are behaviors that people engage in with regularity, with just this real habitual nature, and there are corresponding changes in brain activity or pathways. But there's nothing in anywhere that we can see or use to assume that that means anything negative.
Yeah, I remember the very simplistic stories they'd give out in 101 stats, like, okay, so the cat is red and the cat likes a certain type of cat food, therefore all red cats like cat food, right? Or this particular, so kind of teaching us bias, of course, in research, and also teaching us the importance of not coming to conclusions. Like there may be two results that happen and they seem to coincide, but that doesn't necessarily make it so. And I think that's a lot of what you're kind of trying to explain here.
Yeah, we see things that are happening in the brain, but we have absolutely nothing to correlate them with. Right? If you want to see the changes in a person's brain, like Ricky was alluding to or saying before, seeing this picture that Patrick Carden would put in, here is the brain of somebody who is chronically using cocaine. All right. Well, just looking at that alone, can we really make any judgment about that if we don't know what that person's brain looked like before? Right? There's no before to all of these after pictures that these people like to parade around. So right off the bat, there is no science behind it. Just, if nothing else, based on that. Right? And
which
then
kind of goes along with the kind of new research talking about addiction from a different paradigm anyway, which is even substance abuse addiction from this perspective of attachment and early childhood trauma,
and the rat cages, right?
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about that?
Cages. Yeah, that's fascinating. There was a TED Talk. What's the guy's name? Johann. I'm not remembering his name.
Hint or something like that.
There's a fascinating discussion of rethinking our view of addiction, again, less from this neurochemical perspective and more from a social and attachment one, that they found rats, even in active withdrawal from cocaine and morphine, when put in social colony cages with lots of other rats, just simply did not use drugs at anywhere near the level that when they're put back in their own cage by themselves. And it certainly is a powerful metaphor to humans when we get into these kinds of behaviors that more often than not lead to isolation and loneliness and a kind of a downward spiral of depression and self-loathing that drives increasing reliance on the behavior to medicate the anxiety and the pain, and feeling ever more isolated, so down it goes.
Mm-hmm. And I have to say that a lot of these newer perspectives and these newer approaches are actually more and more undermining the whole brain disease and sex addiction concept. I'm sure you're familiar with the website Your Brain on Porn.
Yes.
And there was one of the articles I was reading very, very recently. I can probably get you the specific reference. But I was reading through this and had my own little eureka moment and just started to laugh out loud, because I bet you they do not even realize what they just said themselves. Making the statement very, very clearly that their own admission that when they talk about sex addiction, pornography, the effect of masturbation, the effect of porn, all this kind of stuff, they themselves have now said it is not damage, it is pathological learning. And that's basically what we've been saying for years, that these are behavioral associations, these are anxiety reducing / anxiety producing behaviors. It's a lot of this about self-soothing, self-medicating. A lot of it's anything but what they say it is. And I don't know if they realize themselves that they've pretty much busted themselves. And I think that's a pretty important statement. It is pathological learning. That's exactly what it is.
And that's really interesting, because that's one of the arguments I was going to bring up that's really talked about a lot, is that not only does the brain light up or looks different, like a brain on porn maybe looks different than a brain that's not on porn. Although to your point, a brain that's used to doing yoga and meditation would look different than one who's not either, right? So, but it's this idea that there's actually damage, like there's a damage to the braking system, quote unquote, of the brain. So people haven't learned how to stop and which kind of talks through kind of compulsive and impulsive behavior. And you're saying that you can't really show there's damage to the brain in that sense.
Right. Now, there are certain changes, there are certain things that we're seeing. This is a perspective that I've kind of looked at pretty recently as well. I'm still kind of playing around with it, but I like a lot of what I see kind of going into it. And it's almost like we can look at this from an evolutionary perspective and see that in some ways your brain and your brain's wiring is experiencing some kind of evolutionary confusion. If you think about it, the natural drive that is sexual arousal, sexual desire, it really is more of, I'll just simplistically say, more primitive brain type of functioning. Well, we have kind of shifted that a lot more, especially in the technology age, and made sexual desire and arousal more of a sort of cortical type of functioning. Now, when the sexual arousal and the sexual pursuing is done with this sort of intellectualization, with this fantasy, as more of a sort of frontal cortex type of activity, that's what we seem to be blunting more and more. That's where that, quote, sexual exhaustion that people are now talking more about might come in. That's where we could see some behavioral or cognitive changes related to how we relate to sex and sexuality. Because one of the big things that's coming out now as one of these criticisms is that people can habituate to porn, and then they find out that, or I should say, as they're habituating to porn or needing more and more extreme types of images to get aroused, then when it comes to sex with a partner, they're experiencing more and more ED. And there's more and more people that are writing about and talking about porn-induced erectile dysfunction. This is anxiety, right? This is anxiety. There's conditioning factors that are at work here.
And again, a masturbation issue. Because when a guy, is for whatever reasons, again, either his own anxiety or interpersonal relationship issues where the relationship conflict causes anxiety, then there's this kind of solace and private. Yes, it's usually, as I said before, shame and guilty, feelings associated with it, but there's high intensity arousal and absolutely no pressure, no demand,
and
no
total control,
no performance worries. And when you're done, you get up, you turn it off, and walk away.
Yep. There's
no one to worry about disappointing or anybody else's pleasure to be responsible for. So it's like this, especially with compulsivity, high frequency, it can't be explained by horniness. It's not just, it's clearly connected to anxiety.
Right.
So when the partner is like, why would you do that when you have an available partner? Of course it's understandable, but very often that has the opposite effect of putting more pressure on the well, put air quotes around the addict.
Mm-hmm.
Because again, it's easy to identify the behavior and have a good, convenient. Of course, it's the porn. When, as I said before, from my experience, it's never about the porn.
Mm-hmm. And again, I want to come back to this intellectualization of sexual desire compared to the physical experience of sexual desire. Because what I think we're seeing is that these individuals who are spending a lot of time with their porn and that intellectualization of their sexual desire and arousal, that's what they're habituating to. I try to find me one person who is habituated to a specific sexual act that they really like their partner doing to them. Right? I don't know if you follow that, but you can, the images, the porn, as long as it's an intellectual fantasy kind of thing, then they get used to it and may need them more and more and may lose the excitement. But has that ever happened with a partner? If your partner does something to you sexually that drives you crazy, that you absolutely love, and they do it to you a lot, do you ever get tired of it?
Yeah, that's very clear now. Thank you. Yeah, right. And would we ever see that as a problem, right? That we habituated ourselves to our partner's excellent sexual
Right.
abilities to get us going. Yeah.
So it's our relationship. It's that intellectualization of it.
Yeah, and I think it is really important to look at that relational piece, that, a relationship with your computer is easier than a relationship with another person when you have to really face complex feelings, emotions, intimacy. I think you mentioned intimacy disorders. And we see that not only with sexuality, we see that, with teenagers and all kinds of people, as far as even being social on the internet sometimes is easier, or we act differently socially on the internet than we would in real person when you have to face somebody and look them in the eye. It's a very different experience that takes a little bit more self-management.
Absolutely. Well, and again, on that very point too, look at what's so common now with these internet relationships. If I'm done with you, I don't really want to deal with you anymore, then I can just very easily ghost you. I don't answer your texts, I don't answer your IMs, I don't answer anything. I basically have disappeared. I can't do that with a real life person. I have to deal with them in some way. So again, this convenience, this power, is all part of, I think, what drives this behavior.
Yeah, there's no doubt the internet has really impacted, that's the understatement of the evening, right? Impacted culture, society, this whole generation growing up online and wired. Old fogies like us remember when girls would run home and write their innermost secret thoughts in a diary and lock it and hide it so their kid brother wouldn't get at it. And now, that personal, that outlet for their innermost angst and emotional expression is the internet for millions of people to share. And it's a strange, adolescent development is really very different today. And adolescence seems longer. I don't mean to insult all the millennials, but it seems that puberty starts younger and adolescence starts as young as 9, 10, 11, and seems to go to pretty much 27, 28 now when young people are saying, what do I want to be when I grow up? And that's a long time to be sexually mature, and kind of this, what we used to call failure to launch. Now it seems to be developmentally normal.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And not for nothing, but mentioning all this other internet stuff, that those areas of the brain that are going to light up with the feel-good types of behaviors, you're also going to see them light up with people in their fantasy sports and their video games and all the other stuff they do online as well.
Yeah.
So to single out,
of course, a lot of people are saying that that's addiction as well, right? Video gaming addiction, and there's definitely addiction language being used for those types of problems as well.
So it would, shopping on eBay, I guess that can be an addiction, and talking to high school friends on Facebook.
YouTube videos.
Right. Anything that we're finding pleasure or escape with.
Being wired, right? What's that statistic that people look at their cell phones every 46 seconds or something like that?
But if you're looking at porn, then it's a problem.
Right. Okay. Is it worth having a discussion about these following terms: habituation versus tolerance, dependency versus habit?
I think it is, because I think another persistent misbelief is this classic slippery slope that tolerance develops just like with heroin, and what starts out, it may start innocent and benign, or what someone might call vanilla kind of themes, but then that doesn't work anymore, and before you know it, the porn addict is looking at the most bizarre and extreme kind of paraphilic and kinky fetish, people's worst nightmares of how extreme can extreme get, and then some trip will be flipped, and it'll lead to acting out in the real world, and cause sex offenses and pedophilia, and so it's quite absurd to think that there's an equivalence that someone can develop. Like I used to masturbate 6 times a day, and now I'm up to 9. And if I don't masturbate, I go into withdrawal. I'm sweating and irritated, and I can't sleep, and therefore, again, there's that equivalence. It's just like heroin or crack. I heard Dr. Drew once say that the big difference is that the withdrawal from sex addiction doesn't start until 2 weeks or a month after the behavior stops. So, of course, my first thought is, why are you taking tens of thousands of dollars to have people come to treatment for a month if their detox if their withdrawal hasn't even started yet?
Right. So dependency, the person can't do without it. Habit, they're just used to it. Qualitatively, very, very different. Tolerance is, again, that it's a cellular phenomenon. Right? It really has more to do with receptor proliferation, or growing more and accommodating a level of stimulation or a level of use. And it requires more and more to achieve that same initial effect. That's not the same as habituation, where you don't react to a particular level of stimuli anymore. I mean, can we really say it's the same thing where a heroin addict needs more heroin in order to get that same high that they're used to getting, compared to a baby, an infant, who stops responding to you making silly faces? That's habituation. Is that the same as tolerance? Right? So I think it's one of those self-justifying kinds of things that people in the addiction field have long since employed to try to give their ideas and their analogies more credibility than they actually have.
We have a friend and hero in this field. He's a hero to a lot of people in the field, Marty Klein. And in one of our, as you know, Natasha, one of our regular online debates around these issues, somebody at one point had asked, well, okay, if you reject this addiction model, then how do you treat? And Marty just so perfectly in a word said, psychotherapy. And of course, people jumped on it like he was being snarky, but I absolutely embrace what he was saying, because again, our job is to help someone point out that this has become just like something like an OCD. This has become a faulty coping mechanism. And how can we find healthier ones? And how can we find, remember how they taught us in graduate school, the markers of maturity, the ability to delay gratification and to self-soothe. So how do we get our patients to recognize those kind of, again, I can comfortably borrow from the addiction language and say, how can we learn to recognize the relapse triggers, or just the triggers, the feelings that, oh, there's that feeling again. I want to go log on, but maybe I'll just push myself to go run around the block instead. Right? How do you, if you want to get out of an old groove, you got to cut a new groove. Right? That's my best answer to habituation. Make a new pattern to get out of the old one.
Right. And that's kind of what it is. You just learn a new pattern of being. See, there's another distinction that I think we need to make with all of this as well, and this is another one of those points that people in the addiction industry, particularly sex addiction and porn addiction, will use, and that is this idea of withdrawal. Right? When you have a physiological dependence, again, it's a cellular phenomenon. When you are denied the thing that now becomes a physical craving, there is a physical reaction. And withdrawal responses are actually the opposite of what the actual drug effect would be, because it's a motivator. Right? Our body has all these different feedback systems to motivate us, and one of the ways it's going to get our attention and get us to give it what it's craving is by trying to motivate us by making us experience the opposite effect of the drug, so we will get the drug and get that effect back. Well, it's a mistake to say that if you are changing or denied behavior that has become habitual, that anxiety you would feel is withdrawal. It is not, it's anxiety. Right? Anytime we are used to a particular pattern of behavior and then we change that behavior, we will feel anxiety. That is not a withdrawal syndrome. And again, that's just another self-justifying term.
Yeah, that's a very important distinction to make. I know that, I started my career actually working with heroin addiction, and, I had people in my office going through withdrawal, and that was quite shocking to see, and, even to the point of people having, nausea and throwing up in my office, or shaking and having, fevers and things of that nature. And I've never had that with, my so-called porn addicts in my office, for sure. And not to minimize, again, the discomfort of anxiety, but it's not withdrawal.
No. Right, exactly.
That's funny. Yeah. We just stepped at the same moment. I was going to say exactly the same thing. Not to minimize that, but there was a really adorable joke from a movie, a kind of a Robin Hood story with magicians, where the setup for the joke is the doctor coming in the exam room and telling the patient, "You've got to stop masturbating," and the patient says, "Why, doc?" And the doctor says, "So I can examine you." And why I appreciate the humor in that so much is because we have patients that come into our office and tell us that they can't stop engaging in behaviors that clearly, by virtue of the fact that they've come to our office and are sitting there talking to us, presumably not engaging in that behavior, belies their words. You're telling me you can't stop, but we've been sitting here talking for an hour and you haven't.
Right.
So, right. We'd be having a different conversation if you literally couldn't stop. And yeah. So I found helpful with a lot of patients in therapy the old classic Jekyll and Hyde analogy, right? Because while everybody can recognize, that Freudian id idea, that kind of inner, if we don't watch our inhibitions, we could cut loose and let Mr. Hyde out, and then there's guilt and remorse and regret. But the real point of the story is that the good, gentle, mild-mannered Dr. Jekyll has to drink that potion. It's a volitional act. He has to choose to drink that potion. So, he may have his angels and devils on his shoulders battling it out, but ultimately there's a decision there that's made.
Yeah.
And that's where we can help with change, and change the decision making, change the coping skills, change the ability to manage stress and anxiety, and best of all, bring couples together in ways that really renew that the relationship can become a source of more anxiety reduction and more of a real oasis than the relationship causing more stress and anxiety, or performance worries, or conflict, or anger, or even just the natural, it seems, inertia of relationships after that honeymoon phase, when things become kind of routine, and for a lot of couples, they then start to get, perfunctory, and before long, a little resentful. And of course, there's nothing loving and sexy about those emotions.
Well, so let's talk a little bit about the concept of neuroplasticity. I think we've kind of, gone this direction, but let's go there further in the sense of, I think that the good thing that is coming out of neuroscience research is this idea that the brain can correct itself, that we have actually quite a lot of power psychologically. So do you want to talk a little bit about that piece?
Well, I think, it's, in a lot of ways, we kind of have been.
That's the new grooves thing, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, what we used to refer to as neural grooves years ago. But I think it's kind of ironic the way a lot of people, I think even in the sex and porn addiction industry, use the term or the concept of neuroplasticity. The concept refers to how flexible neuronal activity and pathway formation can be. And I find it very ironic that they're taking this idea of flexibility and speaking of it with such rigidity. In terms of creating these pathways that we're stuck in, that we're trapped, that are going to be that's part of that lifelong thing. Basically, the concept of neuroplasticity basically means that as we engage in regular behaviors, as we engage in certain patterns of behavior, which also include thoughts, cognitive behaviors as well, then there are corresponding nervous system pathways that are accommodating those regular stimulations. And as most things in living things are prone to, we become conditioned to working in those particular ways and using those pathways. But we have every ability to form new pathways, to change them. The only thing that's missing in all of these discussions is that if we are going to really take advantage of our neuroplasticity and maybe go from one neuronal pathway and now let's form another one, well, there is going to be a little bit of anxiety that is part of the experience of shifting to forming a new direction or a new pathway. But it's really just, everything your brain is doing, everything we're reacting to, everything that allows us to interact with the world around us is brain plasticity. It's that flexibility, that ability to create and connect. There's a downside to it, because our brain certainly operates in primitive ways sometimes. We're often very quick to jump to conclusion. Oftentimes when we think we may recognize a pattern or begin to interpret something in a particular way, we just sort of run with it, often impulsively. But again, where it's what we are primarily about is choices and decisions.
And a healthy relationship with sexuality that's hopefully not so steeped in guilt. I really want to say...
Which, by the way, also forms different neuronal pathways and
yes.
Brain response patterns.
I don't want to run out of time before saying how thrilled I am and really honored to be working with you and with this organization and other therapists throughout the country. Many years ago, my mentor supervised a therapist in Salt Lake City who had two adolescent kids suicide over masturbation guilt, and it was so obviously so heart-wrenching. And to see this advocate and activist group of therapists really wanting to make a cultural change and address some historic sex negative or even pleasure phobic kinds of traditions and remind people that sexuality is spiritual. There's a tendency, I think, for people to think that these are kind of liberal causes and conservative religious people are it's kind of a game. The healthy sexuality is embracing the spiritual aspects of relationship and connection, and all of this can be so health and life affirming that there's so so much spiritual experience is missed because of guilt and shame and feeling like not measuring up to some unrealistic ideal, or rules that very often aren't even consistent or codified.
Well, I really appreciate you saying that. That's very meaningful, because I do agree that in many ways we share very similar goals, to other therapists as far as the connectivity, the spirituality, the intimacy. Is just really more, the concern lies more in how we go about that. So,
right. And in some ways, I think the confusion that sometimes comes up with respect to a lot of the neuroscience and a lot of the claims, especially that people make to try to justify these concepts that you're trying to protect your clients and patients from, it sort of gets in the way. And I think the bottom line is there really is no science behind any of this yet. All the things that we're seeing with all the technology, again, we're seeing individual light bulbs kick on in a variety of different places. We are nowhere near in the evolution of our understanding of the brain and the evolution of neuroscience to be able to make any direct connections between any of these little things we see lighting up and what is the result of complex, complicated, multi-gene involved behaviors. We talk about behavior and brain function as if these were very simple, linear types of connections that we can make. And that's the last thing that they are. So we really have a difficult time being able to identify specific brain parts or functions, and even the simplest of behavior. So for something that is really so complex and multifaceted, like porn use and sexual desire and sexual arousal and relationships, I mean, it's really kind of silly and not just a little arrogant to think that people understand what it is that they claim to be talking about.
yes. So I know I've had you for a while. Do we have another 15 minutes or so to talk then about kind of some of the treatment issues that I wanted to bring up?
Sure.
Okay. So you mentioned earlier, Marty Klein's statement of, the one-word answer of psychotherapy. So, so help me talk through this idea about why would, a sex addiction treatment approach not fall under a psychotherapy approach?
Wow, that's a really great question, and I've wondered that myself, and especially I've heard people talking about it like it's a formal modality, the addiction treatment model, and sit and think like, how is this not cognitive behavioral therapy you're talking about, but just using a different, just different words. So, again, therein lies the problem when there is no consensus on what the word addiction even means. So, an addiction specialist or a certified addiction therapist, what's the specialty if it's right? If it's just so, as we said before. So there is, oddly, even in the evolution of addiction treatment before sex addiction, it was always this very kind of begrudging relationship between the kind of purist 12-step AA model and psychotherapy. It wasn't really until the rise of the treatment center industry in the 80s and the so-called Minnesota model, or the 28-day inpatient treatment model, became the most common one, which was really steeped in those principles of AA and 12-step work, which really kind of set the field off on a bad foot because, AA is free, and they're allowed to say things like it's a perfect program if you work it perfectly, and you just gotta pray harder and work your steps harder and get a sponsor, and but a treatment center that's just billed your insurance company $60,000, and if you leave treatment and go get high again, they really shouldn't kick back and be arrogant and say, well, I guess they didn't want it enough, or they didn't hit their bottom yet, or we'll still be here when you decide you had enough, as if maybe wouldn't be a good opportunity for them to think of maybe where their treatment failed. I see routinely
Or a medical
now,
prescription shouldn't be go to a 12-step meeting.
more and more often, and I'm just awestruck by how often I see 23, 25, 28-year-old young people who have been in 15, 20 treatments or more. That, like I said, not only is that adolescent development so much longer today, but so many of this generation is spending those years in and out of treatment and struggling with these chemical dependency problems. And yet I think I told you, Natasha, I'm finishing my doctoral research on this very field, that treatment centers offer really, well, anything they can think of that they can get reimbursed for, whether or not there's any research basis showing its effectiveness. But now, there's a clear and growing body of research evidence that shows that integrating healthy sexuality in addiction treatment, not just for the sex addicts or the ones who've had a history of sexual trauma, but for everybody who's in treatment, strengthens the treatment. It improves compliance. It decreases relapse rates. And, brilliant people like Doug Braun-Harvey and Raven James have been putting this into action for quite some time. So, it's breaking through. It's another kind of traditionally conservative and resistant culture that we small but mighty sex-positive advocates really have to gently but firmly prod a cultural change to find this kind of permission to be more accepting of our sexuality and have a healthier relationship with it.
And I also think another disconnect is when we look at really just the basic principle of psychotherapy, and we look at what really drives us, particularly ethically, but certainly what the whole purpose is about, things like self-efficacy, autonomy, self-reliance, all things that, while rhetorically may be there, are not there in a, quote, addiction treatment approach, where there is this fostering of dependency on the program or on the steps themselves. The idea of self-reliance and autonomy is not really there because, a lot of the treatment in that perspective is simply about learning to accept and live with the idea that you have this uncontrollable thing in you and that you have to be kind of almost obsessively aware that at any moment it could rear its ugly head. So in a lot of ways, if there was more psychotherapy, I think as part of that treatment approach, it would be a lot better off. There is psychotherapy in what's called an addiction approach, particularly for things like sex and porn, but they have that shame base, that connection to shame, the connection to fear. It really does not foster, I think, independence or healthy relationships.
To your question about treatment, I want to bring it to couples a little bit and share this observation as well. And I'm sure you and anyone listening who works with couples would agree that more often than not, sex addiction is, quote, diagnosed after some bust. Right? It's the forgetting to delete the browser history on the computer, or some receipt, or some the cell phone. Looking at the text messages on the phone. Right? Yeah, that's the new lipstick on the collar. And so when this is what reveals the crisis. This is the confrontation. As I said before, look at what it does to the relationship dynamic. And if, statistically, I think, again, we'd agree that most often the presenting, what we see in our offices is a heterosexual couple where the guy is the one that was busted, and the woman is now the angry cop, right? Or the angry mommy. So now we have this dynamic where he's the humiliated adolescent who's been caught, with the most humiliating and embarrassing act, self-defiling, whatever, this heavy burden, and now he's in that role. And again, we have this justifiably or justified angry person who is, when I hear partners, wives say things like, he's not allowed to go near a computer now. That's a real red flag for me, because, not allowed is not something a partner or lover says. That's something a parent says. And it's similar to just more kind of garden variety sex therapy cases where there's a loss of desire. And you see that dynamic. If a partner is acting more like a parent, it's natural to have your desire up and split, because we're not supposed to be turned on by mommy or daddy. Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
No, and this is very prevalent in the work that I do. Yes, as far as what people come.
And so again, one of the problems I see in this sex addiction model is it really reinforces these roles. Now, very often the therapist says to the angry mommy, "You are right. Oh, what a burden now. You're married to a sex addict, you poor dear." And again, now she doesn't have to think about the relationship, the drift, why it's gone to this point. I've had guys in my office, angrily defending themselves and saying things like, "You should be grateful I was looking at porn and not out cheating on with someone else." That's a powerful thing to hear in a therapy session.
Yeah, and I don't hear that much from Mormon men. Mormon men are buying it. They're like, "Yes, I am. I am depraved.
Right.
I am awful. I am doing something very sinful and horrific here." And I'm not saying that they don't have a right to have their religious values around some of those issues, and they may not have the value of wanting to look at pornography.
Of course.
But the compounded shame for me is often the problem in making the problem worse. Instead of like freeing them up to have some ability to look at their sexuality from a different perspective, we have now actually burdened them with more of a problem, because to your point, if your underlying issue is anxiety, and now you've just been placed into an adolescent parent relationship with your spouse, well, that really doesn't help anxiety lessen at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right, and may increase the acting out that they're familiar with.
Right.
Again, as I mentioned before, I think it's important that we remember that all discomforts and embarrassments aside, we are really talking about masturbation. And again, not falling to easily just blame the porn. And of course, that's a difficult thing to talk about. So towards the treatment and the unwanted guilt and shame-inducing behaviors, I've had a lot of success. Instead of just trying to take an abstinence model, which increases the pressure, increases the anxiety, and increases the sense of failure or incompetence, it's very helpful to go more like a step-by-step, again, a kind of psychotherapy, like a systematic desensitization type of therapy, to first disconnect the self-pleasuring behaviors from the porn. Because a lot of times, with that habituation Larry was talking about, and the sheer intensity of the sheer volume of the easy access and high arousal, and usually very high grip and speed. That's where I think the fact that can't be duplicated with a partner is what also makes it easy to blame the porn if there's something like ED. It's just because he's, he can work himself up in ways that he can't with a partner. And now there's the added pressure of the partner's needs and expectations.
And if I could add to that, you're talking about people who generally are very high self-monitoring. So when you're alone at the computer, pleasuring yourself, that high self-monitoring comes in the form of really manipulating your arousal, manipulating the intensity, what a lot of people refer to as edging, and you're in that total control. And then when you're done, you're done. But with a partner, that same high self-monitoring now becomes self-conscious because of those other interpersonal factors that now come into play. So the anxiety and that self-consciousness, the spectatoring, the disconnection. So when people have developed that kind of relationship to their porn, then they have to learn how to make that switch. Now, there are some people, too, that I think what you were kind of also referring to, been hearing more about what people are referring to as rebooting.
Right.
Right? Where just like anything that you are used to doing consistently and habitually, and it's getting to the point where you're kind of feeling you're doing it for the sake of doing it. I mean, no matter what the behavior is, if you kind of take a break from it, to help maybe sort of reset, recalibrate the system.
Excellent.
It can kind of help to kind of strengthen those other bonds. You still want to work on those intimacy bonds. You still want to work with that relationship stuff. But it doesn't have to be done out of fear. And it doesn't have to be done with this sort of this shameful, I can't even touch myself anymore. It's a refocusing. There's also nothing magical about it either. A lot of the science that's coming out seems to be making big deals out of things that really aren't big deals. In fact, I'm often reminded of years ago when fiber was really starting to be touted. Everything had fiber in it. That you'd have these bottled water companies that were bragging about no fiber. Well, when did water ever have fiber?
No fat.
Right? Why is this something that you now have to make a big deal out of? Well, I think we're seeing a lot of that with a lot of the brain science that's coming out as well.
And of course, the testosterone and the shot clinics and the desire in a pill. It's of course, that seems to be the great American way too.
Right. So going back to the treatment part, what would you say? I mean, a lot of people come into the practitioner's office self-diagnosing themselves as sex addicts. So can you speak to that phenomenon?
Again, I really just want to know why. What's the behavior, and why do they believe why they call themselves an addict, and what is out of control, and see, again, not contradictory or belligerent. I will meet the patient where they are, but of course I believe that we are all obligate educators, and those teachable moments to explain, to normalize, to discuss sexuality. Like I said before, we can choose to not have sex, but we can't choose to not be sexual. And coming to grips to accept having sexual thoughts and fantasies and urges, and being able to choose to act or not choose not to act on impulses, and still be able to derive pleasure from being a sexual being.
So basically, first thing is really explore the need or the preference even for the term sex addict.
Right. As you said, Natasha, a lot of people do grip very tightly to it as an identity, and I'm sure there's a lot of comfort in there, just like it's comfortable for the other partner to keep that focus and not have to think about change, maybe difficult change. So, of course, we need to assess the commitment to the relationship, even with what's usually a high level of anger and a sense of broken trust, especially if there was infidelity or lying, breaking of rules. Of course, trust rebuilding. And of course, I know I have my bias, but I think sex therapy is a pretty effective way of helping couples reconnect lovingly, affectionately, and rebuild trust and be able to refocus slowly, step by step, their affectionate and erotic energy back toward the relationship. And like I said, get this crisis in the rearview mirror as quickly as possible and move forward, not permanently, not make the crisis the new normal for the rest of forever, of this really unproductive, counterproductive dynamic.
And I would also, think that it's very helpful, given some of the dynamics of what people that are sort of coming to us with these issues have, because so much of the sexual arousal and desire, as I mentioned before, is in the person's head, and as part of the treatment, and for the relationship as well, but also to reground and refocus the individual, but what we call sensate focus, or non-demand touch or pleasure, to kind of re-experience or relearn how to receive touch without having to have anything to worry about from head to toe. It's an entire body, it's a whole body experience, and it's something that a lot of people don't have experience doing, and that's just being and just letting themselves be touched, be pleasured, while they only focus on what it feels like. And it helps keep them and ground them back in their own body and get them out of their head, where most of the problem is coming from anyway.
Yeah, I like what you said in another conversation I had with one of you, but that the goal is to put the problem in the back seat and start focusing on the future and changes and explorations. And whereas the sex addiction model, in a sense, puts the problem in the driver's seat. That's what you're focused on. That's what the therapy is about. Every session, you're talking about that particular issue versus a wide variety of other things.
Yeah, it defines everything.
Yeah, it sure does. And sometimes even inappropriately so, in my opinion. We understand that chemical dependency addiction treatment, part of the philosophy is that addiction is a family disease. And to be really effective, you can't just take the addict out of the system and treat them and put them back in the system without addressing the whole system. So there's a family component, and weekends, the spouses or partners come in, and even the kids. And again, just adopting this addiction cookie cutter, it's all the same, we can treat it no matter what it is. I've seen some really inappropriate things, like I don't think kids need to know, for example, that daddy has a problem with porn and has to go away to treatment and have family meetings. I think it's hugely inappropriate, and talk about permanently cementing the shame. Now we're going to make it intergenerational.
This is such a problem in our culture, where in-laws feel like they have a right to ask, their son or daughter-in-laws about their sexual activity. It becomes a family crisis. Everybody knows about it, and these are very personal, private matters, that are really nobody's business. How we're conducting ourselves in the bedroom, and what kind of sexual problems we might be having as spousal partners.
Yeah. But apparently in that culture, everybody makes it their business. So let me ask you, if I can, how does that actually change the approach to how we would work with somebody? I mean, would you treat somebody differently who is in that situation?
Who's in an LDS context situation, you mean?
Where everybody is talking about it and everybody knows, would you sort of indulge that and bring them all in as
Oh
part of?
my goodness, absolutely not. I'm immediately helping the couple set appropriate boundaries, and educating them on what is developmentally appropriate, what's spousally appropriate, and like you're saying, children don't need to know about their parents' sexual activity, and it's actually developmentally inappropriate, really, to include them in that type of a scenario and processing. That's an adult process. And in-laws, there's a lot of boundaries that can be crossed regardless of sexuality, but definitely in this particular aspect. Which, sometimes, obviously, when there's been large amounts of betrayal, the first people you go to comfort you are your family, or loved ones. So I understand that there can be some of that in a sense, but I've heard of really kind of more, things like ongoing interviews, like the patriarch of the family, the grandpa type, will sit down with all his sons-in-laws, every 4 months and just kind of interview them about, okay, have you been looking at porn? Some things like that I'm like, whoa, that's a real boundary, issue there. And how do you feel about that? And I don't think that sounds correct to me, so. But to your question too, I don't know that all LDS therapists would agree with me, but I think one of you mentioned once, if a person thinks they've got cancer and they walk into the oncologist's office and say, hey, I've got cancer, and the oncologist says, okay, let's look you over and, start the diagnostic assessment process, and no cancer is found, they're not going to say, well, let me meet you where you're at, and let's continue to look at how you might, you have cancer. And so I really take a very psychoeducational approach with my clients. I ask very specific questions about frequency, about, content, what's really happening, because when somebody comes into my office and says they're a sex addict, that could mean 5 bajillion different things. Right. And then really just informing them, that there's kind of educating on this idea that you may have religious values, and your sexual activity may be going against your own religious values or your marital religious kind of contract, but that in of itself does not deem this behavior problematic in the sense of diagnostic or criteria or things of that nature. So I'm very upfront about that. I don't wait around for them to figure that out for 10 sessions.
Very good. Good.
But maybe I'm not meeting them where they're at. I don't know. So that's some of the...
No, I think that's really kind of doing your job.
Yeah, and I have a big forever gratitude to another friend and hero, Russell Stambaugh from Ann Arbor, who helped me see that we all are a little guilty of perpetuating this myth of non-judgmental counseling. I think, well, aside from the fact that we're human beings first, and it's a nice ideal, but in fact, it's a little freeing to recognize that we are absolutely supposed to be judgmental. That's our job. But, ideally we make a clinical judgment and not a personal one. I'm also incredibly honored by just this affiliation, and I know that, again, culturally, there's a tendency to want to keep things kind of in-house, and the fact that you're intentionally bringing experts and therapists from outside the church to help inform your treatment approaches is awesome, and we're really honored to be taking a part in that.
Well, I'm incredibly honored that you would be on. I hope that my audience can understand the caliber of professionals that are on this show and really appreciate your words of wisdom. I know I have milked you for way too long of time, but I have done so purposefully because I can't get enough. So I apologize for taking so much of your very valuable time, but I would like to open up for closing remarks, or maybe cover anything you feel like I haven't asked you about, and just be able to finish this out on whatever thoughts and opinions you'd like to share with us lastly.
Let me kind of just bring it around, and look at it from the standpoint of the greater context that I think most people in this country learn about sex and sexuality is one of discomfort, mostly because we're not used to having any real information about it. It's always been, this sort of keep in the dark, shame-based type of thing. And unfortunately, for many people in many different traditions, when you add the religious component to it, it kind of just makes that a little bit worse. So the fact that people are not used to talking about or dealing with healthy sexuality makes it unfamiliar, which makes it, by definition, uncomfortable. I would like to see, if I can, wake up one day in the world and see that people no longer conflate discomfort with shame. I think a lot of these kinds of issues can sort of help correct themselves. But until then, I think if more people realize that there are a number of behaviors that people can become involved in, particularly behaviors that bring us pleasure, oftentimes using these pleasurable behaviors as a way of not feeling some of the, let's say, less than pleasurable things that people often feel in their lives, and kind of come to rely on those behaviors. Well, they're never going to work. If we're going to be using these pleasurable behaviors for anything other than to feel good, I think we're kind of setting ourselves up for some potential problems. So if we embrace our sexuality as part of our humanity, as part of the God-given gifts that were bestowed upon us, and we're meant to use and meant to enjoy. And if we were able to maybe approach them with more of an open heart and more of an open mind, less concerned about what we're supposed to do and more focused on what we are comfortable doing and what we're not comfortable doing, then I think we can change a lot of these scripts. Until then, we shouldn't be rushing into crisis just because we find ourselves faced with a problem or an issue, particularly in our relationship. If people take their vows seriously, at least the vows most people still take, these are nothing more than opportunities to work through and make the relationship, I think, more solid. Instead of it being a crisis, people obsess on their own hurt and pain, and then it becomes the last thing that they ever wanted it to be. So I'll leave it at that. Rhetoric aside,
I have nothing to add except just to repeat. I think what you're doing is just fantastic, and hopefully a model that others can learn to change values that are all of those common threads we've been talking about for this past hour. Sexuality, spirituality are supposed to be sources of joy and gratification and connection, not sources of shame and isolation. So just to reiterate that silver lining that we're so fortunate to be able to help people see that even in crisis they can reconnect and move things forward. So I hope this is just the beginning of a long professional affiliation, and we're really, really excited and looking forward to, it's I think, both of our first time in Salt.
For me as well.
Looking forward to discovering Salt Lake City and working with you. And thanks again.
Thank you so much. And I also just want to throw out there, too, that for the past year, I have sent you probably every single journal article I've come across that supports sex addiction and said, wait, well, what about this one? What would you say to this? Because, I just want to be so careful about my positions and talking to the board of, of the Mormon Mental Health Association and everything. So I can't thank you enough for all the time you have spent helping me in that regard and educating me. And and again for your time tonight. It's just been phenomenal.
Such a pleasure. Again, to reiterate what Ricky was saying before, just can't say enough about what you're doing, and from the statement to the association to the work that you're doing. So it's truly a pleasure and an honor for us to be a part of that as well. So thank you.
We took the long road home, turned minutes into miles, and as the evening traveled on, the sunset bathed your smile. We stopped beneath the desert stars, wrapped in each other's arms. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth.
A trail with tears, pain and sorrow too.
But through every storm we traveled on, like lovers do. And if sometimes we fell apart, we always came back home. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth. Some people say love is blind and forever is too long. But I see your eyes in every sunrise. Can't imagine life alone. Let's take the long road on together until we're gone. Want you by my side till the day I die and into the beyond. It's as simple as our love is. That's how I wanna go, all wrapped up in the arms of our extraordinary, it's nothing ordinary love. Ordinary. No, it's extraordinary.